The cameras were rolling. The audience was watching. The host smirked, thinking he had everything under control. But then, Stallone spoke. And in that moment, everything changed. What was supposed to be a routine interview turned into a complete disaster, but not for Stallone. With just a few words, he flipped the script, shut down the host, and left millions speechless. The internet exploded. The media panicked. And what happened next? Nobody saw it coming. Stay tuned, because this is the interview that shook Hollywood to its core. Sylvester Stallone wasn't just an actor. He wasn't just a man who played tough guys on screen. He had faced real struggles in life. He had been through hard times, rejection, and years of fighting to achieve his dreams. He knew what it was like to have nothing. He knew what it was like to be told he would never make it. And most importantly, he knew how to stand his ground. The audience was excited as Stallone walked onto the stage. Some were fans, eager to hear him talk about his movies. Others were there to see if he would crumble under the pressure of the host's tough questions. The host himself had a smirk on his face, believing he had the upper hand. The conversation started smoothly. The host asked about Stallone's career, his fitness routine, and his latest projects. Stallone answered with his usual charm and confidence. He shared stories from his time filming Rocky and Rambo, making the audience laugh with his humor. Everything seemed normal. But then, the host made his move. Out of nowhere, he shifted the conversation. He brought up politics. He started talking about Hollywood's responsibility to support certain ideas. His tone changed. His smile faded. He was no longer just asking questions, he was setting a trap. He leaned forward, looking directly into Stallone's eyes. Don't you think actors like you should use their platform to promote progress? Don't you feel that staying silent on certain issues is irresponsible? The crowd went silent. They had seen this before. This was the moment where the host tried to corner his guest. Some celebrities in the past had stumbled. Some had tried to give a neutral answer but ended up looking weak. Others had lost their cool and made themselves look bad. But Sylvester Stallone was not like others. He sat back in his chair. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look confused. Instead, he smirked. He knew exactly what was happening. He knew this was not a real conversation. It was a setup. And if there was one thing he had learned in life, it was how to handle pressure. The audience held their breath. What would he say? Would he try to avoid the question? Would he give in and say what the host wanted? Stallone leaned forward. His voice was calm, but his words were powerful. You know, I've always believed that people should think for themselves. I didn't grow up rich. I didn't grow up with everything handed to me. I had to fight for what I have. And you know what I learned? People don't like being told what to believe. People don't want actors, politicians, or TV hosts telling them how to think. They want to decide for themselves. The audience erupted. Some cheered loudly. Others gasped. The host's confident expression disappeared. He wasn't expecting this answer. He was expecting hesitation, maybe even fear. But Stallone was fearless. The host tried to regain control. He forced a laugh. But surely, with your influence, don't you think it's important to take a stand? Stallone didn't back down. His voice remained steady. I take a stand every day. I stand for working hard, never giving up, and believing in yourself. That's the message I share. Not everyone needs to get involved in politics. Some of us focus on inspiring people in other ways. The crowd loved it. People clapped. Some even stood up. The host was losing control of the conversation, and he knew it. But he wasn't done yet. He had one more trick up his sleeve. He leaned in, narrowing his eyes. But don't you think Hollywood needs to change? Don't you think there are outdated ideas that need to be erased? Stallone's smirk grew wider. He saw right through it. He saw the host's attempt to push him into saying something controversial. But Stallone wasn't falling for it. He looked directly at the host and said, I think Hollywood needs more honesty. People should be able to speak their minds without fear. That's what real change looks like. The audience exploded again. The host had no words. He had walked into his own trap. And Sylvester Stallone had just turned the tables. And this was only the beginning. The studio was buzzing. The audience was shocked. Some were clapping, some were whispering, and others were sitting in complete silence. They had never seen the host struggle like this before. He was always in control. He was always the one leading the conversation. But now, for the first time, he looked unsure. He had planned to trap Stallone, but instead, it was Stallone who had him cornered. The host forced a smile. He didn't want to admit he was losing. He adjusted his tie, shifted in his chair, and cleared his throat. He needed to turn things around. He couldn't let Stallone walk away looking stronger. He had built his entire career on making guests uncomfortable, and he wasn't about to stop now. He leaned forward. His voice was calm, but there was tension underneath. He was preparing for another attack. Sylvester, I respect your opinion, the host said smoothly, But don't you think that by staying neutral, you are actually allowing the wrong ideas to spread? Don't you think silence can sometimes be just as dangerous as supporting something bad? It was a clever move. The host had used this tactic before. It was designed to make the guest feel guilty, to make them question their own stance. If they didn't answer carefully, it could make them look like they were supporting something controversial. But Stallone was not an ordinary guest. He chuckled. Not a nervous laugh, not an unsure laugh, but a confident one. The kind of laugh that told the host, "I see what you're trying to do." "You know," Stallone said, sitting back in his chair, "when I was growing up, nobody gave me anything. Nobody handed me success. I had to fight for it. And do you know what that taught me? It taught me that the most dangerous thing in the world is not silence. It's forcing people to say what you want them to say." The audience reacted immediately. Some gasped. Some clapped. Some even laughed. The host's face tightened. He was losing control again. Stallone continued, his voice steady and strong. "People don't like being told what to believe. They don't like being told they have to pick a side. They want to think for themselves. That's called freedom." The host's jaw clenched. He could feel the audience turning against him. He had invited Stallone onto the show to make him look weak, but instead, Stallone was winning over the crowd. The host shook his head and forced another smile. He still wasn't ready to give up. He had one more plan. He needed to make Stallone look outdated, out of touch. He needed to make him seem like a man from the past who didn't understand the modern world. He leaned in again, lowering his voice slightly. "That's an interesting point," he said, "but don't you think times have changed? The world is different now. People expect celebrities to use their voices for important causes. Don't you think actors like you have a responsibility to lead?" The audience went quiet again. They were waiting for Stallone's answer. The host was trying to paint him as an old-fashioned man, someone who didn't understand the modern world. If Stallone answered wrong, the host could twist his words. But Stallone was ready. He didn't hesitate. He looked directly at the host and said, "You know what my responsibility is? It's to entertain. That's my job. I make movies. I tell stories. And I try to inspire people to never give up. That's my role. If people want to get involved in politics, that's their choice. But nobody should be forced into it." Boom. The crowd erupted again. People were cheering. Even some members of the audience who had come to support the host were now nodding in agreement. The host was struggling now. He could feel the energy in the room shifting. He had tried every trick in the book, but nothing was working. Stallone was not backing down. The host took a deep breath. He needed to change the subject. He needed to move away from politics before he lost completely. He grabbed his cue cards and quickly scanned them, looking for another angle. "All right," he said, forcing another smile, "let's talk about Hollywood. You've been in this industry for a long time. Do you think Hollywood has changed for the better, or do you think it's getting worse?" Stallone smirked again. He knew exactly what was happening. The host was trying to steer the conversation into safer waters, but Stallone wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. "You know," Stallone said, pausing for effect, "Hollywood is a funny place. It used to be about telling great stories. It used to be about inspiring people. But now it feels like a lot of people in Hollywood care more about pushing messages than making good movies." The audience clapped again. Stallone continued, "People just want to watch good films. They don't want to be lectured. They don't want to feel like they're being forced to think a certain way. They just want to enjoy a story. And I think that's something Hollywood is forgetting." The host's smile was gone now. He had lost control of the interview. He had invited Stallone onto the show thinking he could trap him, thinking he could make him look bad. But instead, Stallone had turned the tables completely. The host was out of options. He had no more tricks left. But the show wasn't over yet. And what happened next was even more shocking. The energy in the studio had completely changed. At the start of the interview, the host had been the one in control. He was the one leading the questions, pushing the conversation in the direction he wanted. But now he was barely holding on. Stallone had flipped the entire situation. The host had thrown every trick he had, but none of them worked. Stallone wasn't afraid. He wasn't intimidated. In fact, he looked like he was having fun. The host's smile was gone now. His confidence had faded. He glanced down at his cue cards, flipping through them quickly, searching for something, anything, that could help him regain control. He needed to find a way to shift the conversation, to put Stallone back on the defensive. But nothing was working. The audience had turned. They were no longer looking at the host with admiration. They were looking at Stallone. He had won their respect. He had won their attention. The host cleared his throat. His voice was slightly weaker now, but he tried to sound confident. "Well, Sylvester," he said, forcing another smile, "you've made your point. But let me ask you this, do you think people in Hollywood should just stay quiet? Do you think celebrities have no responsibility at all?" The question was meant to put Stallone in a difficult position. If he said yes, the host could accuse him of being ignorant. If he said no, then the host could argue that Stallone was contradicting himself. It was a classic trap, a no-win situation. But Stallone didn't even blink. He had seen this kind of question before. He had been in Hollywood for decades. He knew exactly how these people operated. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness in his tone. "I think people should do what they believe is right," he said. "If a celebrity wants to talk about politics, that's their choice. But they shouldn't be forced to. And they shouldn't force their opinions on others either." Boom. Another strong answer. The audience clapped again. The host's plan had failed again. He had hoped to trap Stallone, but instead, he had given him another opportunity to win over the crowd. The host's frustration was starting to show. His smile had disappeared completely now. He shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie. He had one last option. If he couldn't win with words, then he would try something else. He would try to make Stallone lose his temper. This was another trick that had worked before. The host had done this to many guests. He would keep pushing them, keep needling them, keep saying things that would make them angry. And once they lost control, once they started shouting or getting aggressive, that was when he won. Because no matter what they said, no matter how good their argument was, if they lost their temper, the audience would turn against them. They would look emotional. They would look weak. And so, the host smirked. He was about to go all in. "You know, Sylvester," the host said, leaning back in his chair, "you talk a lot about freedom, but don't you think that's just an excuse? Don't you think some people use freedom as a way to avoid responsibility? Some people say they're just thinking for themselves, but really, they're just afraid to stand up for what's right." The room went dead silent. This was a direct insult. The host wasn't just asking questions anymore. He was attacking Stallone's character. He was implying that Stallone was a coward, that he was afraid to speak up, that he was hiding behind the idea of freedom because he didn't have the courage to take a stand. The audience turned to Stallone. Everyone expected a reaction. Everyone expected him to snap, to get angry, to raise his voice. That's what the host wanted. That was his final move. But once again, Stallone didn't take the bait. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward aggressively. He didn't point his finger or call the host out. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He laughed. A deep, genuine laugh. The kind of laugh that made it clear that the host's words didn't bother him at all. "You know," Stallone said, shaking his head, "I've been in Hollywood for a long time. I've met all kinds of people. And one thing I've learned is that the people who talk the most about responsibility are usually the ones who do the least." The audience erupted. Loud applause. Cheers. Even some whistles. Stallone wasn't just winning the argument, he was completely dominating it. The host's face turned red. He was done. He had tried everything, every trick, every angle, and nothing worked. No matter what he said, Stallone had a response. A calm, confident, powerful response. For the first time, the host looked at the clock. The interview wasn't over yet, but he wanted it to be. He wanted to move on to the next segment. He wanted to get away from this conversation as fast as possible. Because this wasn't just an interview anymore. It was an embarrassment. But just when he thought things couldn't get worse, something unexpected happened. A member of the audience stood up. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, almost half the room was on their feet, clapping for Stallone. It wasn't planned. It wasn't staged. It was real. The audience wasn't just impressed by Stallone's answers. They respected him. They saw that he wasn't afraid. They saw that he wasn't playing games. The host sat there, frozen. He had lost. Not just the argument. Not just the interview. He had lost the respect of his own audience. And the worst part? The cameras were rolling. Millions of people were watching this moment unfold in real time. And soon, millions more would see it online. The clips would be everywhere. Social media, news channels, YouTube, everyone would be talking about what had just happened. The host had invited Stallone onto his show, thinking he could make him look foolish. But instead, it was the host who looked foolish. And Stallone? Stallone walked away looking like an absolute legend. The moment was over, but the impact was just beginning. The host sat there, stiff and silent, as the audience kept clapping for Stallone. He had lost. There was no way to recover from this. No clever comeback. No last-minute trick. The cameras had caught everything. The energy in the room had shifted completely, and no amount of smooth talking could undo it. The director of the show, watching from behind the scenes, panicked. He had never seen a guest flip an interview like this before. This was supposed to be a controlled environment. The host was supposed to lead the conversation, steer the narrative, and make the guest stumble. That was how things worked. But Stallone had walked in and rewritten the rules. And the worst part? The cameras had recorded every second of it. The producer in the control room whispered into the host's earpiece. Move on. Get to the next segment. Now. The host forced a smile, but his hands were clenched into fists. His mind was racing. He wanted to lash out, to find some way to regain control, but it was too late. Stallone had won. The audience had already decided whose side they were on. All right, the host finally said, forcing out a chuckle. That was an interesting discussion. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about your upcoming movie. Stallone smirked. He knew exactly what had just happened. The host wanted to change the subject. He wanted to move on as if nothing had happened. But the truth was, the damage was already done. This moment would live on long after the show ended. The cameras cut to a commercial, but the audience wasn't done yet. People were still clapping, still cheering. Even as the show cut to break, the energy in the room remained electrified. And then, just as expected, the real storm began. The internet explodes the moment the show ended. Clips of the interview flooded social media. Within minutes, #StalloneDestroysHost was trending on Twitter. People from all over the world were watching, commenting, and sharing their reactions. Some were laughing at the host's failed attempts to control the conversation. Others were praising Stallone for standing his ground. YouTube was flooded with reaction videos. Sylvester Stallone just embarrassed this TV host on live TV. You won't believe how Stallone took down this host. The interview that shocked Hollywood. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. The internet couldn't get enough of it. People dissected every moment, every response, every expression on the host's face. Some slowed down the footage to show the exact moment the host realized he had lost. Others made memes about how Stallone had bodied the host in his own studio. Even celebrities joined in. Big names in Hollywood started tweeting about the interview. Some praised Stallone for standing up for what he believed in. Others tried to defend the host, but the damage was already done. The people had spoken, and they had picked their winner. For years, this host had been known for his ability to control the conversation. He had built a reputation as someone who could corner any guest, twist any words, and always come out on top. But now people were seeing through him. They saw how hard he tried to trap Stallone. They saw how desperate he became when it didn't work. And they saw how easily Stallone had dismantled every single argument. Critics started writing articles. The moment that exposed this talk show host's true nature. How Stallone outsmarted the host in just 10 minutes. Has this host finally lost his edge? The network executives were panicking. They knew how powerful public opinion was. If the audience turned against the host, ratings would drop. Advertisers would pull out. And worst of all, the show's credibility would be permanently damaged. Behind the scenes, meetings were being held. Producers were scrambling to figure out how to control the fallout. Some wanted to issue a statement. Others wanted to bring Stallone back for a follow-up interview to try and clarify what had happened. But no matter what they did, they couldn't stop what was coming next. Stallone speaks out. While all this was happening, Stallone remained completely calm. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't worried. He wasn't scrambling to explain himself. He didn't need to. The people were already on his side. But eventually, he decided to break his silence. Not in a press conference. Not in a formal statement. But in the simplest way possible. He posted a single tweet. Freedom means thinking for yourself. No one can take that away from you. That was it. Just one sentence. But that one sentence sent the internet into another frenzy. People took it as a direct message to the host, a final response to everything that had happened. It was short, it was simple, and it was powerful. Celebrities started retweeting it. Fans started sharing it. News outlets started writing articles about it. And just like that, Stallone had the final word. The host? He stayed silent. For the first time in his career, he had nothing left to say. The damage was irreversible. The host's silence only made things worse. Usually, when controversy hit, he would go on the attack, release a statement, or bring in more guests to steer the narrative. But this time, he had nothing. He was cornered, just like he had tried to corner Stallone. Behind the scenes, the network executives were in full-blown crisis mode. Meetings were happening at all hours. They knew they had to act fast before their show's reputation took an even bigger hit. They considered releasing a statement defending the host. They even debated bringing Stallone back for a friendly discussion to fix the situation. But no matter what they did, it wouldn't change the truth. The people had already chosen their side. The biggest problem wasn't just the interview. It was what the interview exposed. People weren't just angry about how the host treated Stallone. They started looking back at old interviews. They started noticing a pattern. Clips from previous episodes resurfaced, showing the host doing the same thing to other guests, interrupting, twisting words, setting up trap. Only this time, the people weren't fooled. The comment sections under these old clips were now filled with angry viewers. We see it now. He's been doing this for years. Stallone exposed everything in one interview. The trust was broken. The mask had slipped. The ratings of the show dropped sharply. Advertisers began pulling their sponsorship. It wasn't because of Stallone alone, it was because people had stopped trusting the host. They no longer saw him as a fair interviewer. They saw him as someone who manipulated conversations for his own agenda. Then came the biggest shock of all. A leaked report from the network revealed that they were considering replacing the host. They had built their brand around him, but now he was a liability. They needed to save the show. And if that meant getting rid of him, they were willing to do it. Social media exploded again. People were divided. Some of the host's longtime fans defended him, saying that he was just doing his job. But the majority of the internet didn't care anymore. They had already moved on. And just a few weeks later, the official announcement came. The host was stepping down. They called it a mutual decision, but everyone knew the truth. He wasn't stepping down, he was being forced out. His reputation had crumbled, and the network didn't want him dragging them down with him. The internet celebrated. The same people who had once watched his show every night were now cheering for his exit. While the host's career was falling apart, Stallone's reputation had never been stronger. He wasn't just a Hollywood legend anymore, he was a symbol of standing strong under pressure. Fans flooded his social media with messages of support. Even people who weren't into movies started following him, just because they respected the way he handled himself in that interview. Hollywood insiders took notice too. Directors, producers, and actors started speaking more openly about how controlled the media had become. They weren't afraid anymore. Stallone had given them the courage to push back. And when reporters asked him about the host stepping down, Stallone's response was perfect. "I never wanted anyone to lose their job. But I do believe people should be held accountable for their actions." It was simple, classy, powerful, and just like that, Stallone won without even trying. Months passed, but the interview never faded. People still talked about it. It became a turning point in how audiences viewed media and interviews. Other celebrities, politicians, and public figures started being more careful about where they went for interviews. They didn't want to get trapped like so many had before. And for the host? His name became a cautionary tale. Whenever someone tried to manipulate an interview, people would bring up Stallone's moment. Don't pull a Stallone host move. It became a meme, a warning, a joke that lived on long after the cameras had stopped rolling. But for Stallone? It was another victory in a life filled with them. And the best part? He never even had to throw a punch.